We're so glad you've decided to tune in and join us. We are working on the independent contractor versus employee part 1 of this 2-part series. We're going to be going through employee and independent contractor relationships and those lovely potential tax liabilities that can arise due to those relationships. As I did just mention, this is a 2-part series. So in the 2 parts, what we're going to be covering, if you think of both of these being a comprehensive guidebook, part 1 that we're in right now, we're going to define what the employee and contractor is, how to, a little bit better understand that classification, and some really cool options, which I'll let you in on at the end, what's called VCSP. If you don't know what that is, stay tuned. You're going to find out very shortly. It's a great option that allows us a way that we can help a client. In the second part of the series, we're going to be going more in depth, understanding misclassification, how the IRS and the court factors come into play. We're going to look at a few court cases so we can say, okay, this is how this played out, and at the end I'll tell you how that was actually decided so you can test your knowledge in a sense. We'll look at some safe harbors and also the lovely SS8 determination. So this really is a comprehensive guidebook. You can consider it for part 1 and 2. If you would like additional information, please check out my website where we have course manuals posted there. Just because that you attended this course, that's an added benefit for you. Please check that out and you'll get the part 1 and part 2 course manuals from my website. As we go ahead and dive right in, what we'll be going over specifically in this course today, in the part 1, we will define employees and independent contractors. We will look at the advantages and disadvantages of both. We will look at the misclassification liability and penalties that certainly can arise because of it. Talk about the Memorandum of Understanding. Look at statutory and other types of classifications that can also drive whether they're an employee or independent contractor, and look at that IRS VCSP program. So that is our agenda. We'll be covering a lot in the course of the next hour, so stick with us, and by the end I'm hoping you'll learn something new that you hadn't known before. So as a basic overview, if we look at just kind of the topic of independent contractor versus employee, the factors that are used, there's a lot of concern when we look at from our employee sides that they go, the employer is so much easier just to call them independent contractor. I don't want to deal with all that stuff. A business can subject itself to a tremendous amount of legal obligations when it hires an employee. It has the burden of complying with numerous and sometimes contradictory laws, and they're put in place by federal, state, local governments, other regulatory agencies. We can see why that's a temptation and why it's so overwhelming. If we look at just a few of things that potential employers may find themselves subject to as they're weighing this decision, if you look at minimum wage requirements, federal and state, overtime requirements of state and federal governments, including new rules that have been passed in some states, like my own home state of Colorado, we change the minimum wage every year. That can be kind of frustrating to an employer. You have to make sure you're withholding, remitting, and reporting properly, Social Security, Medicare tax, income state, federal, state, all these various things. And then you have to say, well, what about anti-discrimination laws? They have to accommodate certain disabilities. They have to allow time off to vote for jury duty. They have to provide workers' compensation coverage, pay premiums on it, report and pay federal unemployment taxes and state unemployment taxes. They may have to comply with OSHA requirements. They have to allow time off to have, often, depending on the size of the company, to have a baby or care for sick parents. They may have special requirements from their own liability insurance carrier. They may even have to provide a minimum level of health insurance or face a fine for that, depending again on the size of the company. So when you look at all these, for benefits and employees' demands for vacation time, sick time, personal time, other possible benefits, it's, as you can see, the list can keep going on and on and on. So it is that it can be very burdensome, and the temptation for somebody looking at hiring help, they may say, I don't want to deal with all that. I just want to take the easy way out, and they foresee, maybe I'll call them independent contractor. I see that as an easy way out. But maybe by the end of this course, you'll be thinking differently, and you can help to educate, and as our job sometimes is, help educate your clients otherwise to say, let's just make sure, because that liability risk can be much bigger, certainly. So that's kind of a real quick overview of how they may view it. Obviously, having employees, it's a significant cost to the employer, and they may have an opportunity to hire independent contractors instead of employees, maybe reduce some costs and provide flexibility. It can work out really well for the business as long as the independent contractor really is an independent contractor, not an employee. So the risk is what if they are really an employee instead of an independent contractor? they can be much higher for the business than if it was that they just went ahead and went through all the requirements of hiring an employee. The reason why is that the IRS can audit the business and reclassify the workers as employees instead of being treated as an independent contractor. And then there's the risk of the back taxes and penalties that can be assessed, and it becomes so burdensome that it could easily put an organization out of business. So it is important to make sure that that classification is done right from the beginning. You also look at a potential risk if an independent contractor is injured and files for worker compensation benefits, because there could be an investigation launched and the worker could be then reclassified as an employee at that point. And that could cause back workers' compensation premiums to be charged, potentially increase future premiums. They can also file for unemployment benefits and cause the State Department of Labor to open up an investigation as well. So there's a lot of different ways that a worker can open up investigations against an employer if they really believe that they are truly an employee versus an independent contractor. And then that's all those costs that become burdensome for the business just because they tried to take an easy way out and call them a contractor. So as we say, okay, how do we really tell? How do we begin to start sorting this out? Because our clients may really not know very well. Maybe we don't know very well, which is, of course, maybe the purpose of why you're attending today, is to help make that a little bit more clear. So we're going to go through and we're going to help to define these a little bit better. So we're going to start out with an employee. Now, some of these you may say, oh, that's common sense. That's easy. But we'll just start out with the simple definition from Black's Law Dictionary. They basically say an employee is a person who works in the service of another person under an express or implied contract of hire, under which the employer has the right to control the details of work performance. Even though that's the technical definition, let's see if we can define it a little bit better for you. So an employee is an individual that contributes labor to the activities of an organization. So we're like, okay, I can get that. They work for someone else. But employees are usually hired to do specific duties and have job descriptions usually. So we're talking about direction, control. That's a very big and important part of this. Also looking at the method that payment is made. Employees are usually hired on let's say, a time-based hourly wage, for example, salaries, paid by piece rate. They're based more in their payment method in a different fashion than contractors who may be paid per job or per a specific contract. Looking at how the employers work, they have a right to control and direct the work. They have a lot more control over this individual when they're really an employee. It also really doesn't matter if there's some sort of an outside contract labor agreement, because it really comes down to the relationship of the parties. So for federal employment tax purposes, an individual is an employee if they meet the regulations laid out in the section of the employment tax regulations. I can give you the sections if you really want to see those. They're in the manual that you can get from my site. But in those sections, they are defining under employment tax regulations what an employee is. They describe an employer-employee relationship when the work is performed, they have the right to control and direct the work. And we're going to come back to that point a few times because it is a very important point there. It doesn't even matter if they actually exercise the control, just that they have the right to. And it doesn't, like I said, matter if there's any agreements, because they can be disregarded and just based on the relationship. Again, the pay structure, it is usually a specific amount of pay per time worked, and that is a little bit different than what our independent contractors will be. As we look at in our independent contractors, the other side of the coin, we can again go back to Black's Law Dictionary and say, okay, what is an independent contractor according to Black's Law? A person who contracts to do work for another person according to their own processes and methods. So we're going to kind of center on that. Who's controlling it? Who's making those decisions? The contractor is not subject to another's control except for what is specified in a mutually binding agreement for a specific job. And again, while this legal dictionary description is a good start, we're going to see if we can define it just a little bit more. As we look at independent contractors, again, what is the difference in the direction and control? We said independent contractors provide goods and services to another business on terms determined by some sort of a contract. It could be a written contract, could be an oral contract, but that's the really only control. The rest of the manner that the independent contractor is able to perform those services is at their own direction and control. So another difference here is it's often not in the same line of work as the business that hires them. So what do we mean by that? For example, a doctor's office might hire an independent contractor to do landscaping or repair a leaky faucet, but these individuals do not provide services in the medical industry. So here's another little insight into, this person they're hiring, is this like a one-job hire? Is this something that's not in their line of work? Or is it in their line of work? Are they controlling how they want something done? As we look at the same employment tax regulations referred to as we were talking about employees, it says individuals who hold themselves out to the public and they do the same services for others, well, they're going to be more of an independent contractor. And that's because that they're in business for themselves, and it's really displaying that because they're not just working for the one company, that one individual. Examples of independent trades that fall into this category are like physicians or lawyers, dentists, contractors, and of course accountants. We work for a variety of different clients. We wouldn't be necessarily an employee of just one if we're doing that work for lots of them. Pay structure is that they're usually paid by the job. That's another one of the differences quite often in an independent contractor compared to how employees are paid, and often without any regard to the time involved. Usually independent contractors have to put some sort of a bid together and say, for this job, I'm going to repair your leaky faucet, it's going to be X amount. Regardless of if that takes 5 minutes or 50 hours, and that's going to be some insight later, is that independent contractor can mess up and quote a really bad price and possibly lose money, where an employee really doesn't have that concern. They're paid by whatever the amount of time is that they're putting into the work. And we're going to be talking about how the government uses a variety of factors that we're going to discuss a lot more in detail in the part 2. But they're going to say, okay, let's go through these and start putting some tests to it and see, okay, who has control and how are they paid and all these different tests. So that's some insight into what we will cover even more in depth in part 2, is how you start comparing. Very often, too, an independent contractor, it's a lot more common to have some sort of a contractor agreement, but that is that it's more for a specific job and it's not a long-term relationship, where employees are usually more long-term of a relationship. It's also that if we look at common law standard is what it is that it's set. Common law flows chiefly from court decisions handed down over time, and it suggests that a treatment of a worker as an independent contractor or employee is a function of the legal definitions. So whether one person is legally responsible for the acts of the other, and the technical terms, if the principal is legally responsible for the acts of the agent, it always stems to the principal's right to direct and control that agent. So that's going to be more insight into, it sort of, and all these tests, the court factors, IRS factors, seems that most of it that I've seen centers around control. Who has the right to make those decisions?